Hello and welcome to another edition of Shattered Lives. I'm Paul Healy, Chief Reporter with the Irish Daily Star. We all know policing can be difficult wherever officers work, and it's sometimes dangerous. But imagine having all the normal stresses of being a police officer, and on top of that, constantly having to live with the real threat of a terror attack. That's exactly the situation that some 6,700 officers in the Police Service of Northern Ireland face today and every day. Today, Irish Daily Star crime correspondent Michael O'Toole interviews Liam Kelly, the chairman of the Police Federation for Northern Ireland, the representative body for most PSNI officers. Michael spoke to him in the wake of the murder attempt on Detective Chief Inspector John Caldwell in Omagh, County Tyrone, last month. Mr. Kelly gives us a fascinating insight into what it's like to live under threat and how it affects every aspect of officers' lives, from where they live to the precautions they must take before they even get into their car to drive to work. Today's pod is a real eye-opener.
Liam Kelly, Chairman of the Police Federation of Northern Ireland, thanks for joining us on Shattered Lives today.
Good morning and great to be here.
Now, Liam, as I was explaining to you off air, our pod, the Irish Daily Star's crime pod, is very popular with members of Gardaí. So one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you today is just to explain what it's like being a police officer in Northern Ireland, because it's only a few miles away, but in many senses it's a completely different world. And I'm allowed to say that because I'm from the north myself, and as will become clear in this interview, I would have an interest in the knowledge, and I grew up in North Belfast throughout the whole of the Troubles. So I'm not saying that in a sort of the north's a million miles away. I'm just saying policing, they're two different parts of the world because of the extra stresses and strains the police officers have. So I'm just trying to really go through that for members of the public who are listening, but also for Gardaí. Lots of Gardaí listen to the pod, as I said. So hopefully by the end, everybody will have a better understanding what it's like to be an on-the-ground police officer in Northern Ireland.
Well, hopefully I can help with that.
Now, one thing we might start off with, the Police Federation of Northern Ireland, I believe that represents multiple ranks within the police, the PSNI. Would that be right?
Yeah, that's correct. We represent what are termed the federated ranks, which is your student officer, the constables, sergeants, inspectors and chief inspectors. So that real range there from student officer through to chief inspector rank.
And does that cause, so say for example, I'm used to dealing with the Garda Representative Association, which you'll know, and that deals with members of Garda rank, and then there's the Association of Garda Sergeants and Inspectors, and then there's a separate association for superintendents. So does that cause any difficulties? Because you're having supervisors in the same union or the same association as frontline constables.
Well, not really, because we have a bit of an eclectic mix. We have our representatives who cover all those areas of business, but the vast majority of our representatives would be of constable rank. And really having inspectors and chief inspectors as part of our remit actually smooths the path when they're having discussions with the more senior management in the police. So again, I look upon it as it's not a challenge. It's actually it assists us with what messaging we're trying to do. I mean, right through to the chief constable. Okay,
so we're going to be talking about, this interview is largely based on the attempted murder of Detective Chief Inspector John Caldwell a few weeks ago, and just the attendant issues and threats that PSNI officers of all ranks, I suppose, have to live with on a daily basis. But just before we go there, I presume that you as an association deal with similar issues, say to the GRA or the Police Federation in London, the Met in London. You have to deal with discipline, you have to deal with everyday welfare of your officers.
Yeah, I mean, most federations are set up for the welfare and efficiency of their particular areas. So we have a lot of commonality with all our colleagues in Garda Síochána as well as right across the United Kingdom. We're also involved in collectively in what's called Eurocop, which is a combination of our colleagues right across Europe, and that's useful as well because it obviously gives us a different lens in looking at things that are happening internationally as well as instead of having a tunnel vision of what we're looking at within ourselves within our own small worlds.
So separate from the attendant issues that I would argue are probably unique to the PSNI in Europe and definitely in Ireland and Britain anyway, would you say that police officers in Ireland and Britain and Europe as part of Eurocop, you all effectively, apart from the terrorist issues, you all effectively have the same problems and the same issues? Would that be fair?
Yeah, it is fair. I mean, the primary issue that certainly the most prevalent issue at the minute for PSNI is in relation to budget. Because the budget isn't effective enough, we have a real issue at the moment in relation to resource. When we stop recruitment, our numbers are dropping. We're actually at the smallest level the PSNI has ever been. And I say as we're approaching 25 years of the Good Friday Agreement, our police service should be at around 7,500 people. At the minute, it's sitting around 6,700 and dropping rapidly. Which is quite strange, because when I look at the investment, for example, in Garda Síochána, they have a commitment from the government to increase Garda, but they're having an issue in relation to recruitment as well. So it's not that they haven't got the money, it's because the job itself isn't as amenable as people have looked at in the past, and there's all sorts of reasons for that. One of them is salary, pay and conditions, the restrictions that are placed on police officers in relation to what they do both on and off duty. There's a lot of commonality there with what it is, and I say the difference that we have is that we have a budget going backwards, and everyone else seems to be having a budget that's going forward. So I put that in a various position.
I can just imagine all the Gardaí listening to this nodding their heads and going, "Yep, that sounds like our job." One issue that has started to affect the Garda Síochána, particularly in the last couple of years, and it was particularly bad last year, is not retirements but resignations. Is that an issue in the PSNI?
Yes, it is. It's a major issue, particularly the more junior officers who have been leaving primarily over terms and conditions, the amount of work that they've had to do. And one of the principal issues we've had coming out of the COVID pandemic is that police officers have been vilified in some regards. And so people are looking at what their pay and remuneration is and thinking to themselves, could I do something else that's a lot less hassle than I'm doing now, and be valued more with what it is. So we have seen a spike in the amount of officers who are leaving, not only in as you mentioned, in retirement, but at the bottom end. But more concerningly, we've seen a number of officers leaving mid-service, who have already maybe got 15 years in the police service and have decided that policing is no longer for them. And there are a number of reasons for that, but primarily it comes down to that work-life balance, which is absolutely enormous at the minute for Garda Síochána. Only yesterday, the Garda sergeants and inspectors had a day of action in relation to the duty rosters that were put in place primarily for the COVID pandemic. But going forward, they have a real issue about a new proposal that the Commissioner has put in. Again, we have similar problems in Northern Ireland. We had a particular shift roster that was brought in for COVID as an emergency pattern, and then it was taken away quite quickly. And at the minute, the organisation are looking, because of reduced resource, in reshaping how the shifts work, particularly for those frontline officers.
And would that emergency roster, I think it's called the COVID roster down here, would that have been 12 hours, tours of duty?
Yeah. It was primarily what was termed a 4-on, 4-off duty pattern, a mix of early shifts and night shifts, which were up to 12 hours long at a time. That's correct.
And one thing I'll say, speaking to Gardaí, particularly on what's called on the regular, so the front line, I think they're called response units in Britain anyway, they really liked the 12 hours because they had more time off and it gave them more regularity. Would that be the same with the PSNI?
Yeah, well, it's a bit of a mix compared to the perm, but certainly the feedback that we were getting from our response officers who were working the shift was that they were definitely having a lot better work-life balance because they could plan better, because the rest days weren't being cancelled in between. One of the other things around it is our response officers work on a 5-shift system pattern, and a 4-on, 4-off, it changes to a 4. So what you immediately end up with is around 20% more people in the sections, and because they had more people, they had more resilience, which means they could share the workload a bit more. And then I say the big key in this was getting the 4 days off in a row, which was unheard of under other patterns.
So just before we get on to the issues that I wanted to talk to you about today, one final question on this. One of the issues that I'm hearing from Gardaí on the ground is the lure of going to work in Australia, particularly the Western Australian Police. Is that an issue? Are constables or officers from the north heading over in numbers? We have, and in the past we did have a number of officers who and I know personally know a few officers who are currently living and working in Australia. It used to be that PSNI officers could take what was termed a career break, and then actually try it before they made a decision to do it. But that was changed because of the amount of officers that were doing that at that time. I don't think we have such a high level now. I know certainly our UK, particularly the Met and some of the services in the southeast of London, there's a massive recruitment drive. I mean, I heard a number last week, and around 800 officers had applied for Queensland Police, for example.
and because of the remuneration package and the change of lifestyle and everything else. So yes, it definitely is a lure to look away. But I think in Northern Ireland, primarily, most of our officers, we do seem to have particularly senior officers. Not only have they went down to Garda Síochána, we've also Police Scotland. In Police Scotland, we have 4 of the senior police officers in Scotland are from Northern Ireland and served most of their careers in Northern Ireland. So we do have the ability to move around, absolutely. But in more recent times, I haven't seen such a big drive of officers here leaving to go, to the other side of the world.
Yeah, I think I saw on the Police Scotland Twitter page the other day, I think it was a female chief superintendent was sworn in from the PSNI, got a very senior job in Police Scotland. So obviously there is that cross-functionality or cross-pollinisation in that regard.
Yeah, we actually have 4 assistant chief constables working in Scotland who were all previously chief superintendents in PSNI, and that's just over the last 3 years.
And as Gardaí will know, there were an awful lot of senior PSNI people, including Drury Harris himself, but there's Assistant Commissioner Roberts, and quite a few have come down south. Anyway, so I wanted to talk to you principally about the attempted murder of DCI John Caldwell. Now, I think, and the effects from after that, I think that was about a month ago, now, or maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago. Without breaching his privacy, can you give our listeners an update as to how he's doing?
Yes, I can. He's still in intensive care in Alton Kelvin Hospital. He's stable, but unfortunately he still remains heavily sedated due to the injuries he sustained. He was shot 4 times at close range into his torso, so he sustained some major organ damage. And really the challenge going forward for him is once they start to bring him out of that sedation, just to see whether he can cope and his body can cope with the trauma that he suffered. So he's by no means out of danger yet, but he is at present, as things stand, in a stable condition.
Because I remember on the night of the attempted murder, obviously, and we'll get into this, DCI Caldwell would have been very well known in the Republic because he was very active in the organised crime front and things. And an awful lot of guards I was in contact with on the night would have known him, and I think it's fair to say that there were very serious concerns for his life immediately after the shooting. Yeah,
absolutely. And what I can say while I'm on here, the amount of contact that we've had from both retired and serving Garda officers who have offered their support in around what has happened has been overwhelming, to be honest, and really good to see. And that's one thing that some people forget about the police family. Despite the fact that we wear different uniforms and work for different governments and things, we do have that commonality with each other and the respect we have for each other about what we have to do in the business. So as you say there, John was very well known, not only within PSNI circles, but obviously he was involved in organised crime, which borders don't stop that. So we had very close contacts with your detective cadre in Garda Síochána. And again, as I said, there's been lots of contact with PSNI at very senior levels, offering support and assistance to John and his family.
John would have had a certain profile before the shooting. Would he have been regarded within the force, let's say, as a heavy hitter investigations-wise, one of the top investigators within the force?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, John has been a police officer for 26 years. He's been a senior investigating officer within our crime operations branch for a considerable period of time. And probably if you look back over particularly the last 10 years of high-profile criminal and murder terrorist investigations, John Caldwell's name was he was the person that was the investigator in that, and he has brought some pretty serious people and offenders to justice because of that.
And we know that the new IRA claimed responsibility, but I know it was certainly news in the last couple of weeks, and I have to say, as someone who is from the north and is a crime reporter and keeps an eye on these things, I was quite shocked, and I think a lot of people were, that members of the Protestant community were arrested as part of this investigation. Did that come as a shock to you and your members?
No, not at all, because I mean the reality around organised crime is that it doesn't matter. Religion doesn't make any difference. These people are in this sort of work for one thing, for betterment for themselves, and primarily around money and finance. And so they can put aside any of their supposed differences when they have a common gain. So no, it didn't surprise me whatsoever. And again, although this investigation was primarily focused on the new IRA. Tags and titles are merely flags of convenience for these people. I say it doesn't really matter. Their only loyalty is to themselves and the financing their ill-gotten gains.
So would you believe that really is, I'm not going to say a cover, but it's maybe a fig leaf to hide their true raison d'etre, which is criminality?
Well, there's no doubt about it. I mean, the terrorists have to engage in criminality to finance what they're doing. So, that's deeply wedded with each other. I mean, I don't think anybody's in any doubt about that.
Okay. So, can you talk to us a bit, Liam? And this may be a silly question, but it's the answer that's important. What effect did the attempted murder of DCI Caldwell have on your members?
Well, I mean, I think the reality is it's in a real shockwave out across PSNI because, I mean, although we've had a number of attacks primarily on duty, what I'm talking about there in Derry City and Strabane and around November, December time, we had a couple of attacks on patrols, explosive device left outside a police station. But I mean, this year, as a close quarter shoot, is something that we hadn't seen, perhaps into the 1980s, 1990s. It was a real throwback to the worst times of the Troubles. So I'll not say our officers have been complacent over a period of time, but basically, particularly in the off-duty, there's certainly a veil of safety or a feeling of safety that officers could engage in whatever off-duty activities they wanted to do and not be in fear that they were being targeted or looked at in relation to that. Now, that's not to say that traditionally the terrorists, I say, have never gone away, unfortunately. And as we approach that 25 years of Good Friday Agreement, it's incredible that we're still talking about them still being active and doing what they're doing. But what we have traditionally seen on a sporadic basis over the last number of years was for example, the on-their-car booby traps being left at police officers' cars at their home addresses or, at places of leisure. And that was the tactic. Whereas this here, in my mind, was a complete escalation. For two people to approach someone in the car park of a leisure complex with handguns and indiscriminately shoot at him and others, was shocking.
And you're quite right. Look, just to give, I was speaking to you earlier off air, but just for our listeners, that most of our listeners know I'm from Belfast. But just my background is I was born in North Belfast in 1970. So I lived through the whole thing. I mean, you'll know this, that in North Belfast, I think it's something like 25% of all victims of the Troubles were killed within a square mile of where I was living. So it was pretty heavy. So I grew up with this every day. And I started working, my first job was in the Irish News, which would be a nationalist paper in Belfast. And I was working there in 1994 on and off until 1997. And just what you were saying, I remember the last RUC officer to be murdered was a Constable Frankie O'Reilly, and he was killed by a loyalist blast bomb. I think it was 1998, around the whole marches, was it? Yes. But then the previous two officers to be murdered were murdered, just what you're talking about there, up close and personal. They were shot as they were on patrol in Lurgan. Now, I remember I was working in the Irish News and I covered that. So I think that was June 1997. So the threat has always been there, but you're quite right. It does bring back sort of memories. And one of the things I was going to say is, I moved from Belfast down to Dublin in 1997. So the RUC was still in existence. And one of the things that really struck me when I moved down here was how the members of the Garda Síochána were intrinsic parts of the community. So whether they were training the GAA teams, they were involved in rugby, everybody knew who the Guards was. Now, by the very nature of the threat and other issues, my recollection is, especially in my community, the Catholic community, RUC officers effectively had to keep their heads down. Are we going back to those days that really, the threat is so serious now that they have to sort of retrench within themselves?
Well, I think that's what the terrorists is seeking to achieve by the attacks on John and the others that we've seen. That's the whole purpose of terrorism in relation to policing. Is what they're trying to do is to exclude and put a wedge between the police and the community. And I mean, that has actually been taken to a further level last week when we had a further threat, which was specific against police officers' families as opposed to the officers themselves. And again, that's about doing fear, changing what PSNI are doing. And I suppose it's a reflection that our officers, both PSNI and RUC, over a period of time, have absolutely been involved in all sorts of community projects in their own time. I mean, we have people volunteering for all manner of things, whether that be search and rescue, coaching, mentoring, working with church groups, all sorts, and everything that everyone else in the community gets involved in. You definitely have police officers there. The concern being, and what we have seen over time, I mean, historically, police officers wouldn't be very forthcoming about their occupation. And it was for that very reason, is that they could find themselves being targeted, because they set patterns and for example, if you're, as John Caldwell was, if you're a football coach and you're turning up every, say, Monday and Wednesday night in the same place, week on week, year on year, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to work out that you're going to be there at a specific time. And more likely than not, you're not going to be carrying your personal protection weapon, because there's obviously risks associated with that too. Particularly if you're coaching football, for example, you wouldn't be really running around with a gun on you. That's the scenario. So terrorists look for vulnerability. They look for patterns. And I say this whole attack on John and the upsurge in activity that we've seen is basically designed to try and marginalise our police officers. And dehumanize them in some regards, to sort of say they're not a member of the community and they're not welcome. But I mean, the reality around it is we are a member of the community, and we are welcome with open arms in all areas of Northern Ireland, because people recognise that what our commitment is, both on a day-to-day basis with our duties for what we do for society, but they also recognise that there's a lot of transitional skill set that comes across into the other areas there, and diversionary things, working with young people in particular to sort of divert them away from a life potentially of crime or other ways, and show them that there is a better way.
Now, earlier you mentioned that there'd been a significant outpouring of messages from members of An Garda Síochána retired and serving. One of the things that struck me was the cross-community unity and condemnation about the murder attempt on DCI Caldwell. Was that something that heartened members of the force?
Well, I mean, yeah, absolutely it was, because, I mean, as you're aware, at the moment in Northern Ireland, we have no functioning government. And in fact, every day in the news seems to be focused on people clashing over their differences of opinion, their differences of mindset in relation to what they think a government should look like. So it was actually heartening, very heartening, to have the major leaders of the major parties standing side by side in condemnation about what had happened, and recognising, that area that we've been talking about at the outset there in relation to the PSNI's budget. I mean, a reduced budget has reduced PSNI's capability and capacity to deal not only with organised crime, but to deal with terrorism. So it's important that our leaders, our governmental leaders, are able to actually advocate for us and speak to both UK and Irish governments in relation to commitments that were made in the New Decade, New Approach from 2020, which basically ring-fenced that PSNI would have a minimum of 7,500 officers.
And that hasn't happened. You said it's 6,700 at the minute.
Yeah, we're sitting at 6,700 at the moment, and by the end of, traditionally, for taxation reasons, a lot of officers would retire at the start of the new tax year, which is next month. So that number could be potentially another 100 down in a few weeks' time. And I say the major issue spinning off having no budget, as I previously mentioned, is we have no recruitment at present. Mm-hmm. And then to start that recruitment drive again will take time. So in other words, the new people coming in aren't replacing the people that are leaving. So that number is unfortunately receding at a quite rapid rate. I mean, PSNI have modelled this that if things don't change, we could be down as low as 6,000 officers by the end of 2024, which is, when I first joined the police in 1994, we had over, including part-time officers and reserve officers, we had over 13,000 police officers. So when we're less than half of that, without any primarily, front-facing military support anymore around that. And again, it's not enough, and that's the reality. It is not enough.
Yeah, what would 6,000 officers mean? Would you be able to provide a service?
I think we'll still be able to provide a service, but we'll not be able to provide as good a service. And the reality around having reduced numbers is, the ability to respond in a timely manner. So what it could do was that things would have to slow down, because you've less people dealing with stuff. And then the other consequence of having less people, if you're asking, less people to do more, that can bring us challenges as well in relation to sickness and people making mistakes and other things. So the reality around it is PSNI have went through a process of what's called recalibration of principally what they're doing and trying to ring fence certain areas of what are termed their service profile. Now, what that means is, for example, if somebody dials 999, you will get a police response in a timely manner. If someone dials the 101 number, the non-emergency number, it may well be that police aren't coming out to you at all. They might just get a crime reference number, and that's the end of it. Or it might well be that they could come out with you in a couple of days' time, and sort of. So the reality is, the service that our population have been used to over a period of time will significantly look different if we don't have proper investment into the policing to enable us to resource those areas of concern as best we can.
Did I read somewhere, or within the last couple of weeks, or maybe the last couple of months, the Chief Constable announced that because of the reduced numbers, there'd be fewer detectives?
That's correct. We're already in that mix. The Chief Constable gave a briefing to the organisation and then to the public in February, and basically laid that out in stark terms in the here and now. Now, the issue with the here and now, I'll give you some figures on this. One of the things that he had ring-fenced was our neighbourhood policing and that initial community interaction. Now, he had said that he wanted to maintain that at its current level. Unfortunately, we have had people retiring, resigning, leaving. So that number actually reduced by 75, even though he had protected it. The detectives was 96. We had 96 less detectives, almost immediately. There was 97 fewer officers in providing what's called the specialist support. So what I mean by that is specialist search or our public order units reduced. And also, as part of the administration support we had 115 less police staff. So that was a snapshot of the here and now in February. The issue the primary issue that I had, because the budget that we were being told we were going to get in 2023, 2024 was at least £100 million less than we needed. And in fact, they've been asked to model another 10 and 15% on top of that. So that figure with, pressure on utilities and pay awards and other things, that figure is now, in around £176 million. And £160 million when we're in the headcount at the moment to try and save money, it equates to, 500 police officers having to, are not being replaced. And that's just unsustainable. So those numbers will get worse. And that's the thing about protecting your resource. Police still have to be able to respond to that 999 calls, the serious road traffic collisions, the day-to-day business that officers have to do. Those specialist investigations also require resource as well to maintain them and get them done. And the issue that we have is without that investment, our response officers of today are our detectives of tomorrow. And if that conveyor belt is turned off, then what we have is a diminishing resource, and not able to retain. And the other thing around it as well is retention of experience. Once a police officer gets to the point where they can retire, they can't be, forced to stay at work. They can go. And it's getting that balance that's going to be required. And I say we're waiting on the Chancellor's budget, which is tomorrow. And then we'll see what the Northern Ireland budget, because obviously Westminster are managing the Northern Ireland budget in the absence of having a stormont government. So they will set the budget for Northern Ireland. I will be looking at it very, very closely to see what the allocation, or additional allocation, if any, is going to be allocated to PSNI. Just
as a matter of interest, guards get entitled to their pension after 30 years service. Would that be the same in the PSNI?
No, it's changed. In 2015, there was a new pension scheme was brought in. The new pension scheme doesn't work on, it works now on age and not on service. So primarily, prior to that, yes, that was the case. It was a 30-year career when that was the maximum pension you could get would be over 30 years pensional service. It's now changed to the minimum someone can retire is now age 55, but that's on a reduced pension. The actual age, the retirement age is now 60. So what that means, for example, if you have an 18-year-old joiner, they have to work for 42 years before they can get a full pension, or 37 years before they can get a reduced pension. So the financial incentive would obviously be to work to 60.
God, that's interesting you mentioned 2015, because in 2013 there were major changes to the Garda pension scheme, and that's one of the issues that is causing real problems with retention. Obviously a change for the worst, members on the ground would say. So it's just amazing. Obviously it was austerity or whatever, but it just had a significant effect because people think it's not worth staying for their pension after that length of time.
And one of the issues is, one of the things for me is, police has become like any major business. Whereas it used to be there was more people were joining on a vocational capacity, albeit yes, there was good pension and there was good remuneration for it. But what we seem to find out, particularly with the younger generation of things, is policing is a stepping stone to doing something else. So they're not coming in to work 20, 30, 40 years. They're coming in primarily to work 5 years or 10 years and then move on to something else. And that's sort of an unintended consequence as well for new PSNI officers coming in. They get a qualification accredited at the University of Ulster. So it's something tangible that they can bring with them. Whereas when I first joined the police, your qualifications just qualified you to be in the police as opposed to qualify to do something else. So that's an incentive for people to do that. They can get a university qualification as a student officer, and then they can choose to use the benefits of having that in another employment.
And there's no doubt, it's funny you mentioned 5 years, because a former member was saying this to me. American multinationals especially love at least 5 years law enforcement experience on your CV. So it looks really, really good. So you can see why people the grass would be greener on the other side.
It's just, as I say, we're now seeing the millennials, Generation Z coming through of things. So you have a different mindset that what the working mentality is of stuff. So, quite happy to change careers quite quickly, quite happy to have new experiences and do things. And again, unfortunately, the way, policing is looking to retain people as much as they can, because there's heavy investment in bringing people in and getting them up to the standard that they need to be at. And then, unfortunately, we're seeing people leaving, in those early days. But that comes back to the remuneration question again. Prior to our delayed pay award this year, it was taking a police officer 5 years before they were earning £30,000 a year. And with the austerity and the cost of living crisis, people were earning that sort of money doing other jobs where the risks and other things just weren't there. And what I mean by that was even delivery drivers or working in retail or driving lorries or doing other things that they can balance themselves, as opposed to technically putting their lives on the line on a day and daily basis for what was termed not a great return.
Well, that's actually an interesting question. Can you roughly, I know every officer is different, but roughly, what would the average salary be for a PSNI officer? What are we talking?
Well, that's the difficulty because of different pay scales and where you are. So, I mean, as I said, the vast majority of our officers are constable rank. Over 5,000 of our officers are of constable rank. So if you aggregate their salary, the top salary for a constable would be 43,000. The bottom salary as a student officer is currently 23,000. So you do the rough maths in that, you're sort of in the mid sort of 34,000, £35,000 would be the mean average.
And would that be take-home pay, or would there be overtime and allowances? And
that's gross salary. So I mean, one of the things is we pay for a constable, they pay almost 13% of their salary on a pension payment. And then when you factor in all your other bits and pieces and things that you do, taxation, national insurance, all the rest. So, I mean, what we were finding was the take-home pay, for example, for a probationer officer. So that's somebody with sort of up to 2 years service. Their take-home salary net was in around £1,500 a month.
Wow. Now, the reason I was asking about that is I've got a series of questions because I'm looking at it through the prism of it's not normal policing. Unfortunately, being a police officer in Northern Ireland is probably unique in Western Europe, because of the terrorists. So I've just got a few questions, some things that have always interested me. And we sort of touched on this. Do PSNI officers, I know they used to, because the classic thing when I was growing up, and I went to school, a place called St Malachy's in Belfast, which was quite an eclectic mix, but there would have been people there whose fathers were police officers and mothers were police officers. And one of the things that was always said, it's always a bit of a joke, if anybody told you they were a civil servant, you probably had a good suspicion that they were a police officer. Would that be the same now? Do they have to hide their job?
Unfortunately, as I say, and that's one of the things that's really frustrating, of the 25 years post Good Friday Agreement. Yes, we still have to take security precautions. particularly in that off-duty capacity. And yeah, that's a sort of standing joke when you're getting car insurance and things. They ask you if you're a civil servant. And then there was an additional question to that: were you clerical or non-clerical? Because if you're non-clerical, that means you're a police officer, and that's
right.
That's the reality. But it's a sad indictment on our society that at times our officers can't celebrate and can't show that external pride about what they're doing, what their occupation is, because of primarily the personal issue that could bring to them. So it's sad that we're still in that environment.
Now, I know you mentioned, John, the RUC in 1994. One of the things that we always remember growing up, and people in the Republic probably just wouldn't get this, it was even hard for RUC officers to hang their shirts up outside drying because they were green and they were quite unique, so they stood out. So anybody coming along could have said, "Oh, that's a police officer's house." So that shows you how far it drills down.
Well, that's right. And the uniform, you're quite right. The uniform for the constables and the sergeants was a green shirt, quite a high visibility green shirt.
Yeah.
An inspector and above, they had a white shirt. We've moved in relation to the shirts now. We've moved away, and everyone wears a white shirt. But there's also a response uniform, a Wigan uniform, which is PSNI crest and all sorts of it. And the reality is, unfortunately, we still find that police officers, can't hang the clothes out on the line and fear that they could be identified with what they do.
So all these questions really are, I'm just trying to give a perspective that Gardaí on the ground can see what it's like. Would officers still have to, I think you mentioned this, would they still have to check under their car for booby traps?
Absolutely. And again, we get security briefs and reminders in the workplace to do that and not be complacent, because as I said at the start, the terrorists look for complacency and they look for patterns. So the reality is, and the term that people would use, you have to get the knees wet today, because what that means is obviously it's not just a visual check as you sort of walk towards your car. You actually have to physically get down and have a look. And it used to be, and it's funny because I was listening to a podcast the other day where people were talking about doing that and trying to explain and hide their occupation from their children. And one of the things they would say would be, for example, they're checking under the car to make sure there's no cat under it, when they're driving off. So, in other words, just to normalise it, really. That's what it is. So yeah, absolutely. We've had a couple of undercar booby traps in the last few years on officers, both outside of workplace and in fact at their home addresses for things. So that acts as a stark reminder. The officers should continue to do that, because if they don't, the time that they one of these things around it is the terrorist only has to be lucky once. The police officer has to be lucky every time. So don't give them the opportunity. Have a look.
And what about socialising? We mentioned the last 3 RUC officers to be murdered, and 2 PSNI officers were murdered, Stephen Carroll and Ronan Kerr. But I think the 4th last officer I remember covering this was a man called Darren Bradshaw, he was killed in a gay bar. It's no secret. He was, that's where he was killed. It was near where I worked in Belfast. Do officers have to be careful where they socialise? Yeah,
absolutely they do. And again, that's going back about setting patterns. And unfortunately, in Darren's case, at the time, the LGBT, which were sort of a reduced number of areas where they could socialise, and that became the vulnerability for him. In that, recognising that he would go to a particular bar at particular times and he wouldn't be armed as well, which would make him an easy target. So yeah, again, that's all part of the off-duty stresses and strains that are on police officers every day about where do they go, where do they socialise, and again, that feeds into that terrorist narrative as well of trying to be exclusionary and trying to not let police have the normal lives that everyone else in society has. So it's just a matter of balance. It doesn't mean you should adapt your behaviour completely to be completely risk averse. What it means is you should try and mix it up a bit where possible, and be careful about setting particular patterns.
And what about where officers live? When I grew up, officers mostly lived in either Protestant areas or mostly Protestant areas. Would that be the case now? I moved away in 1987, so I wouldn't be that drilled deep down about the communities now, but can PSNI officers live in Catholic Nationalist Republican areas?
Well, there's nothing to say that they can't. However, the reality around it is that creates a vulnerability both for them and their families, because primarily that's where the support base and where some of these dissident terrorist groups are still masquerading and still have influence. So from a personal safety point of view, police officers generally would not live in the areas where they grew up. And that can be loyalist or nationalist. It's not specific just to the nationalist community. And again, as you've mentioned there, some of the estates and some of the areas maybe wouldn't be deemed a safe place for police officers to live. So they therefore move towards what's termed the hinterland, on the outskirts of major cities and other things, and that's where they would live. And you've got pockets of that, as you quite rightly identified, around Northern Ireland, where police officers feel it's safe for them to live. But that also comes at a cost as well. When you talk about affordable housing and things, particularly for those junior officers, and it's expensive at the moment to get a mortgage. It's expensive to get rent, and again, that has its own pressures as well, and that feeds into that narrative again of officers not having, the job isn't paying them enough to live, and then therefore they look for something that where they can live back in the areas where they originally came from, because they haven't got what's perceived as a target on their back anymore, because they're not doing the job that some people don't want them to do.
What I'm getting from this is PSN officers have exactly the same stresses and problems and benefits and positives that Gardaí have, but on top of that they have the abnormal threat that is constant. I mean, it's not even probably in the back of their heads, it's probably now at the forefront, and I'm just really interested how people cope with that, because policing is a tough job, and you've got this extra layer of danger in the north.
Yeah, and I'll not say it is difficult. There's no doubt about that, and I say somebody like myself, who's that was sort of the norm when I first came into policing. Can remember at the outset of my career that sort of fear factor and the sort of behaviours that I was having to exhibit to protect myself and my family. That was the reality. I say not unfortunately, but over a period of time, there's no doubt about it that police officers have benefited from the not the imperfect peace that we've had in Northern Ireland, and have been able to become and get involved in more normalised behaviour. But as I say, this is a stark reminder to them again that they unfortunately are still a legitimate, or deemed a legitimate target by these people. So they just need to be very, very careful about doing that.
Do you think, we sort of alluded to this earlier, do you think there will be more situations where officers are armed off duty? They carry their personal protection weapons off duty? Well,
officers are issued with a personal protection weapon, and have been right throughout the history of the PSNI from 2001. That's because the threat level in Northern Ireland up until last year was still rated as severe. It's now substantial, which means an attack is likely on an officer. So it's still quite a high bar. So yes, that's the organisation, exercising its duty of care of the officers, to say that you need to have this weapon, both on and off duty. And it's an officer's choice whether they carry their weapon off duty. I would say, in light of the events that's happened in the last few weeks, there's certainly would be more officers now would be carrying their firearms off duty.
Now, you mentioned there was a sinister threat. It didn't come from the New IRA, it came from another dissident Republican group called Arm the Public. And now this was, I think it was unique, because I can't really remember. Obviously, there are threats issued against police officers infrequently, I suppose, but this was against relatives of police officers. Is that a new direction? It
was in a worrying direction. I think before that, police officers and their families, their families particularly knew that if there was going to be an attack directed at the officer, more likely than not, that family members would become what could be termed collateral damage. And that's what I mean by that is, for example, if you put an undercar booby trap under a vehicle, if an officer's taking children to school or giving their partner a lift somewhere, then they're in that vehicle, and the terrorist has no mechanism of stopping what that has happened. So, and in a sense, it's always been there. But this one here was particularly sickening, because basically saying that trying to drive that wedge not only in the officer from society, but actually trying to drive a wedge within their own families, and saying to people, well, if you're supporting this officer in doing their job for society, then you become that legitimate target and not the officer. I mean, that's sick. And that's quite rightly been called out by almost everyone in society as completely unacceptable.
Would you think that was aimed specifically at police officers from the Catholic community?
No, I think it was aimed at all police officers. Again, I don't think there's you could term it as there a hierarchy of victims in this scenario. Would the dissident Republican groups like to target Catholic police officers more than Protestant, potentially for their own propaganda purposes. I mean, we've seen that with Pater Heffron when he had been specifically targeted because he was the sort of high-profile, GAA player, a Gaelic speaker, and unfortunately that they had targeted him specifically. But no, this applies to all police officers, irrespective. Again, it's the fact that they wear a uniform. Their religion is irrelevant.
See, what I'm getting at there is, obviously, I think from memory, the number of Catholic police officers in the RUC was roughly around 6 or 7%. Now that has increased substantially. I think is it 27%, something like, or 32% of Catholics. So it's gone up significantly. But if they force, the end game, I would, from my side perspective, if they force, this threat, and that forces some Catholics to rethink or to leave, then the Republicans or the dissident Republicans can say, look, this police force does not represent the Catholic people. So that would lead to a diminution of Catholics joining. So, you know what I'm saying there? That might be one strategy, just to widen the gulf, shall we say?
Yeah, and it's an unfortunate thing, it's around particularly what we talked about earlier. This is not only a problem for PSNI and the RUC as well, and we never really had a problem in attracting people who wanted to be police officers. The problem was retaining them, and the problem was having that. A Catholic officer, when I joined as well, when a Catholic officer joined the police, it basically meant that they firstly couldn't declare, what they were doing. Their families, more likely than not, along with them, had to move from particular areas to enable them to do that. So there was a lot of upheaval in that. And I say that needs a societal change more than just, and the PSNI are definitely part of that discussion. So yeah, we went through the 50-50 recruitment as part of the pattern reforms to try and address that number, but the reality around it is unfortunately we still have police officers being and their families or the police career being targeted by terrorists, and this is just another example of that, of trying to scare people or put people in fear that if they join the police, they and their families will be subject to targets, threats, and intimidation.
Right, Liam, last question, and I want to thank you for coming on. I think you've given a really great insight for people outside Northern Ireland what's it like being a police officer in the North, and I think it's been a real eye-opener. But just one last question. Obviously, we've spoken about the shock, but are officers defiant after the attempt on DCI Caldwell? Are they being cowed, or are they saying, no, we're not going to let this affect us, we're going to do our job still?
It definitely made them more resilient around what their values, what their behaviours were in relation to being a police officer. It was a reminder to them that we are cops, and it's what we do. And again, as I said, anecdotally around this, on the evening of that attack, we had an inspiring number of off-duty officers putting themselves forward to come on duty to do something. They support their colleagues who were involved in that. And again, that's something I haven't seen in a long time. So it's important to say that it was an unfortunate incident, but an important reminder to police officers about the stark reality. And we've had this before about saying that there's three communities in Northern Ireland. You've got Protestant, Catholic, and the police are somewhere in between. That the police family is strong and resilient, and things like this here don't deter us from what we do. It encourages us and makes us more resilient to do better going forward, and also to have that community support. That they can have confidence in what we're doing and ensure and give us the information and evidence that results in people who carry out acts such as that attempted murder of John Caldwell, to give us the evidence, put them before the courts and put them behind bars, which is where they belong.
Liam, thanks very much. And I know that an awful lot of Gardaí know Detective Chief Inspector Caldwell, and everybody is praying that he makes a recovery from his injuries.
Yeah, thank you very much.